here with Miles Joris Peyrafitte, director, co-producer, and composer of his second feature, Dreamland, at Tribeca 2019. So let's start off with just why this film, why now?
Well, I think for a number of reasons. I mean, for me, there never is kind of like one thing. It was sort of a perfect storm, first of all, of a kind of story and template for a story that I didn't really imagine that I would ever get to make. It wasn't something that was like on my bucket list of films to make, like a kind of 30s period piece. So it was really scary when I first read it, because it kind of felt like a classic. It had this sort of like classic architecture of a story about the West, and obviously that tradition of movies is something that I've always loved and was super influential in my first film also. But so first it sort of presented this challenge where I never thought that I would do something that I hadn't written. So it presented a directorial challenge of kind of, since it was in that style of the classic films of going back and looking at directors like, Ford and Hawks and all these people who were getting scripts from studios and stuff like that and figuring out how to articulate those and elevate them. And so there was a part of that that process that I didn't know that was really exciting about it. Then also I just thought script-wise, the possibility and the potential for the landscape and the characters and the emotional state of the characters to actually play off of each other in an engaging way and in a way that didn't just feel metaphorical but felt practical and felt like pulling sort of from like Greek mythology and stuff like that, of the connection of people and the earth and the way that they affect each other, and also that being super relevant now to climate change. The Dust Bowl was also the most serious, up to that point, the most serious man-made ecological disaster ever, and it was something that we didn't learn any lessons from. So there was something about putting these characters in that world where there are those pressures coming, and how that complicates sort of a love story, and how a love story kind of plays in there, if it's a love story or if these are people who sort of like choose to love each other because the inertia of the situation, they need things from each other, but either way that there is this sort of love and there is this but that there was complexity in that, and that I saw that I could play around in that a little bit and use the landscape and them to do something fun and interesting, I thought. And then Margot was attached to produce and star in the movie, and it was like, are you kidding? It was like after Sundance, my first meeting in LA, it was with Margot, and we talked about As You Are the whole time, and I thought I was like dreaming. I was like, this is ridiculous. So then when I sort of, after that first meeting, I sort of had to reread the script a bunch of times and had a bunch of thoughts of how I would sort of, because she really wanted me to try and make it my own, in terms of just making it personal. And so I kind of pitched to them and to the writer what my idea for that was, and they were like, yeah, let's do it. So it was also such a collaborative experience, and she was so just really exciting to work with, because she's willing to take risks and she's willing to try different things and really put faith in people.
This is, I would argue, your second period piece. Although you did the first one, you set it in the 90s to make it kind of closer to your emotional story you wanted to tell. In this case, how did you, what did you do to not alienate yourself and the audience from kind of these antiquated rhythms of language and
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that you just kind of... It's hard, but I think ultimately it just comes down to ear, you know? Trying to... something that everybody kind of loved about the script initially was that it did have this sort of like, this way of speaking, and it had this sort of like nostalgic feel to it. And so I wanted to try and honor that, and the thing that so many people really responded to in the script. And I think that then when, first of all, they had great dialect coach named Liz Himmelstein, I'm pretty sure, who's literally unbelievable. Because they were also, all the cast were not American. Only Darby was the little girl. So Margot and Finn and the Travis Fimmel and Kerry Condon are all doing accents. But so it was, yeah, it was really, it's just about hearing it. If it's something feels authentic, not to that period, but to the moment, you know, you never, to me, that's kind of the trick, is not trying to figure out like how you do the homework and you set it up so that whatever is in front of the lens tells the story of when it takes place, but that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for the immediate moment, not the moment
right
80 years ago.
which is what sounds like drew you to the film originally in the first place, is like it had a compelling emotional thread that you were like, yeah, I kind of get this.
Yeah, and there was a lot of potential to articulate that thread cinematically, which was the really exciting thing for me. It was like, oh, this is kind of a stage where there are a lot of genre elements, and there are a lot of things that are established, and there's a lot of really fun rules to the story, and there's a lot of fun ways where we can kind of break that, and where I can try and kind of put myself in there, and my sort of my taste in just images, and being able to tell that story through images was really fun, you know.
The visual style in this movie was really cool. It was like supercharged stylistically, but not for no reason. There were some really fantastic shots, like the one where Margot is out of frame, and it's kind of the seduction, the scene where he's choosing whether he's gonna join her in this life of crime or not, and slowly she comes into frame. Yeah. Just tell me about your thinking and like what references or what was your inspiration for the visual style?
Yeah, there were a lot of things. It kind of went back to when I was reading the script of like redefining for myself a little bit the job of the director, and that's what I was like looking at, going back to people like Ford, and looking at like The Grapes of Wrath and a lot, and even Paper Moon and movies like that. And Orson Welles. There was just something so inspiring about and exciting about that time in cinema, when people were moving the camera and sort of like really really playing with space and framing and location specific framing and shooting. So how to integrate those things, I was definitely looking at. Also, Meek's Cut Off by Kelly Reichardt, I think, is a great example of that also. So there were things, I go into a project thinking about like, because you can't know how it'll go or whatever, but for me, I feel really lucky that I got to start making movies when I did start making movies. So it's kind of like, I'll go into something like, okay, if this is like my grad school or something, like I get to learn how to do this thing, or I'm gonna try and figure out how to do this thing, and that was looking at those films and trying to build a visual language that could kind of feel of that time, but also feel subjective, kind of jump between the sort of objective and subjective thing that the story has to do, because it's being narrated, and it goes into sort of different perceptions of events.
Right, yeah, it's kind of an impossible question, because it feels like there's a little bit of everything in the movie, like from the new wave to like there's even some little Edgar Wright moments, and
Yeah, yeah.
And you've got also a lot of kind of Peyrafitte moments, like the mixing of the formats, and it really feels like you're coming into your own as a director and developing your style. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on your own growth as an artist after this movie, in terms of like what direction artistically this is motivating you towards.
Yeah, I don't know, because I think that you sort of, or at least I'm always kind of working on instinct of there's certain sequences that I'll like board out, or certain ideas or shots that I'll know, like, this is how I want to do this thing. But mostly it's sort of like setting up, kind of pre-production for me is learning the language that I'm about to have the conversation of the movie in, you know? So whether that's watching references, whether that is planning things that are sort of going to be these moments, and then when I'm on set, letting instinct totally take over. And there's moments in the dance hall scene, for example, where none of that was like boarded or planned or anything, and we had a night to shoot everything in there. So like a lot of like the kind of big one-er in there when he steals the keys and stuff like that, that was just like just looking at the room, we didn't have time to do more than one setup. So, but it fit into the language of the movie, and it fit into the sort of the feelings, those parameters and rules had kind of been set up before. So I don't know, for me there are things where, in terms of progression as a filmmaker, you're sort of sharpening those instincts and learning when you can trust them, when to second guess them, and when to listen, and how to collaborate with people, how to listen to somebody else's idea without it being an affront to your personal vision, but really being able to let the best idea win. So I don't know, there's who knows how that'll manifest in my next film, but for me it was an incredible experience of learning all of those things. And that was also with As You Are. I mean, it was entirely instinct that I was working on. So that was sort of like a proof of concept to me, in a sense of like, okay, if I am working on instinct and I do set up the rules ahead of time, I can trust myself to figure my way through it,
I'm curious, when do you feel the need to second guess your instincts? Because you've had such success early in your career, and I feel like you could lean into that and do the stuff that got you here, or are there ways you kind of check yourself?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that no matter what decision you make, you're always second guessing yourself, which is the first thing I second guessed myself through this entire process until watching the movie in the theater, and I was like, God, I love this movie. I'm so happy I made this movie. Like, whoa, I learned how to do all these things that I wanted to learn how to do. But I think also it's like just not trying to be too precious about it. You know what I mean? Like, I have so much to learn in terms of filmmaking, in every single department. So for me, the opportunity to get to make a film, the opportunity to learn something new is just always super exciting, kind of whatever direction that in. And I don't want to do things, there was a lot of, after As You Are, there were a lot of like opportunities to do like other kind of traditional dark coming of age movies. And I never really saw Dreamland as a coming of age story per se, in the same way that I didn't really see As You Are, is that it's about a person at a certain, point in their life. But it was also the scariest version of that I thought that I could do. It was the one that I was least sure about. It was the one that was going to be seen by the most people because Margot Robbie was in it, and it was the one that was sort of like, it's got flashbacks, it's got voiceover, it's, you know what I mean? It's got like all of these things. It's a period piece in the 30s, and you have a fraction of the budget that you should have for it. So it was sort of like, oh, well, maybe let's walk into this, like, into a situation that is going to be really hard, because you'll all learn from it, and having having the support system that I had made that possible, and I think made the movie better for it also.
And that seems like a parallel mentality to the way you were just talking about how you deal with being on set after you've come up with all these ideas, but then you have to be aware of kind of the opportunities within the chaos and accidents and how to use them.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of, it's all of it, right? You know, almost every sequence in the movie, there was an original envisioned version, and then there was the practical version of how do we actually do this, and that the way that you solve those problems and the way that you like articulate what you want and how you can solve them to the crew and to the people who are collaborating with you, ultimately I think are what kind of define your style and define your voice as a filmmaker. So that's really dependent on everyone else, like getting it and seeing it and trusting. And that was such a gift that Margot gave me, was just trusting me, because she totally trusted me, and that made everyone else trust me, which wouldn't have been possible without it. You know, we shot the movie in 26 days, which is like only a couple more than As You Are.
Right, that's indie level status.
Yeah, totally. It's tier 1 movie.
Tier 1.
So, which I don't think it looks like a tier 1. You know, like I think that everyone like really went above and beyond in making sure that it feels a lot bigger.
Cool. How about the themes that you're interested in? We talked a little bit about subjectivity before, and that seems to be something that really fascinates you. I'm wondering if you can tell me why you think that appeals to you, or why you choose narratives with that kind of POV storytelling.
Ruben Östlund, he said some shit in this interview that I was like, God damn it. He was like talking about how he didn't understand what like Hollywood's fascination or something with like psychologizing its characters is. He was like, psychology is the least cinematic thing in the world. And I was like, oh, he's right. Like, it is. And he sort of talks about like how to show psychology, you have to show sociology. Anyways, but I think that I have been trying, this film and As You Are both movies that are sort of making this attempt to show the psychology of their characters through the sort of like, through the crafting of the story. I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, I think that movies have played a really important part in my life and sort of understanding myself, and images have, and sort of memory also, and I think that the connection of memory and film is like pretty obvious to a certain degree, but I think that that's also why it affects us so deeply, because why movies affect us so deeply, because they more than like dreams, I think they share a logic with memories. You sort of like remember an event and you think of like the person's face or like their hand, what they were doing with their, you know, it's sort of like these isolated moments that are reconnected in time. And so yeah, it's almost like you can give people new memories, and that I just think that that's a really exciting way of sort of dealing with the audience. And Dreamland is also talking about memory as well. I mean, As You Are is really about that, but Dreamland is the little, you know, his little sister sort of telling this story and saying, I can tell this story because I understand he left me with the same absence and the same like the same hole that he had. So sharing and sort of inheriting absence, and that being something which can also be useful, or not useful, that's a bad word, but beautiful, you know, that by sharing that, by passing that thing down to her, she's actually closer with her brother, you know. And there was that like, I like that mix, sort of tragic, beautiful feeling.
Bittersweet.
Yeah.
I love the girl. She was so good.
Yeah. Darby.
Darby, yeah. Can you talk about the decision to make the narrative a freeing tale through her perspective?
Yeah, the script was always framed. When they sent it to me, the narrator was different. The narrator was Eugene. I think to me it was just I liked the it was sort of like how do you make the story a bit different from also what's been done so many times in that sort of genre. So I thought that there was something, and I didn't want to, like, even though it was going to be the little sister, I didn't want it to be like Days of Heaven, little sister, little girl, and feel too, like, because we were already very cautious that we were, like, tiptoeing into that world, or people could perceive us as trying to tiptoe into that world. But I thought that kind of what I just said about inheriting something as a justification to tell somebody's story was interesting, and as a sort of myth creation element, I thought that was cool.
I interviewed Ruben too, and I feel like his movies are so psychologically driven. Like, even if they aren't portraying psychology or giving the answer to it,
right,
they are all about human nature. And
yeah, but through sociology, like, he sets up these sociological moments where through the way a character interacts with that moment or that situation or that interaction, that sociological phenomenon, their psychology, you as the audience interpret their psychology
right.
through their collision with the other people, which is brilliant, which is why I love those films so much, and why there's like a part of you that's like, one day that I want to go into that direction and look at that, because I think it's such a, it feels really to me like the kind of next step of narrative in a certain way. I don't know. I think
that's really interesting to know. I was going to ask you what's next. Yeah. I wouldn't have expected that. But yeah, I mean, I think subjectivity is also a good way to get active audience participants, because, like, in this story, for example, she says at the beginning, my half brother can't tell it. So you're like, oh shit, does he die at the end, or like does he get away, or what happens? So. Yeah, and also and having an answer to that felt fresh and new, that didn't. Yeah, that felt like it legitimized it in an emotional way as opposed to a practical or. Yeah, as opposed to like it being a book that opens at the beginning, something that actually feels like there's emotional stakes, and how do you retain emotional stakes when somebody is telling a story like that? To me, it was to make it sort of the grown-up version of the person who seems most sort of at risk to a certain degree, and complicate that emotion around it in a way that can also feel relatable to anybody who has felt any kind of loss or disappearance or anything like that. Yeah, going back to the Dust Bowl comparison to the present day, definitely a relevant comparison.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering if you'd consider kind of the anti-patriarchal themes you put in your movies as another anachronistic, like, juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of... Maybe, I don't know.
Like the mean stepdads. You love mean stepdads.
Yeah, and that's a weird thing, because I've never had a mean stepdad. I have, like, literally the most loving, incredible father in the world, who's just, like, the most supportive poet. He's the man. It's funny, As You Are, the story really did require it, and Dreamland, the story came with it, and also kind of required it. But I think also the thing that is interesting about the stepdad in Dreamland is that he also it does kind of have a redemption moment to a certain degree,
Yeah.
Which also felt like I was maybe giving Tom from As You Are a moment of redemption on it's sort of.
That's really interesting.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's also just like you've sort of seen certain power dynamics in movies a lot, and I don't think that Dreamland escapes that totally, you know. But I think that we were all really wanting to make an effort to make it not just feel like a young boy's fantasy about finding Margot Robbie in his barn, you know. And part of that was to kind of try and create a world where these gender complexities or sort of relationships did exist, you know. Or at least that they weren't so cut and dry that you could say that there weren't any complexities, you know. Complicating where George's kind of motivations come from, and they're not coming from a horrific place, you know what I mean? They're coming from a place of like trying to hold on to something that's like fleeting and being destroyed, and that they're just, him and his stepdad are people who are going to go about trying to do that in the opposite ways for the same reason, you know, and that's always a kind of interesting dynamic, I think, in a relationship, you know.
I think it's super interesting that you said that, I forget the dad's name in this movie.
George.
George's redemptive moment in this movie is kind of like redeeming Tom in the last movie.
A little bit, yeah.
When I've interviewed a lot of older directors like Olivier Assayas and people who have made films for 40 years, they talk about the relationship between their movies and how they're kind of building on each other. So I'm curious if you think about that, since if you continue making films, you're young, you have plenty of time ahead of you. What do you anticipate, like building towards something bigger?
Yeah, 100%. The next movie that I'm making, hopefully that I was supposed to make before Dreamland, that I wrote with Madison Harrison, who I wrote As You Are with, takes place on the street we grew up on in Albany. As You Are also takes place in Albany. It takes place, you know, 20 whatever years later. But it's the same world. You know, the same people existed in that world to us. We want it to feel connected. You know, we really want to do 3 films about where we grew up, and for those to be connected. I just did a project that, a smaller thing that I can't really talk about, that has a character from As You Are makes an appearance in it for a moment. And it's super fun to me to sort of like, I like that, I really have always loved the idea of world building, but I like the idea of world building in these sort of like smaller dramatic ways, instead of, you know, just necessarily the sort of huge Marvel whatever. But I think that there is something interesting and cool about having that line through stuff.
And putting yourself in all the films like Hitchcock.
I mean,
You gotta keep doing it now.
Yeah, that one. Well, the one in Dreamland, I was mortified when I realized how early in the film it showed up. Like I think in an earlier cut, it was like later on or something. And then with the way the cut finally ended up, it's like 3 minutes in. I like pop up in there. And it's like, oh no.
Well, no one in the audience noticed.
Yeah. And that's why I cut my hair for the premiere.
I think it's fine. It gets it out of the way. Then it's not distracting later when I don't know. Mike Myers comes in halfway through Inglourious Bastards. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, like, I love being in front of a camera, like, acting also. And if I was a better actor, I would write myself parts in my movies, you know. But I think now maybe I'm become mature enough as a director not to cast myself, you know.
Was that a really great learning process for you though, in like your film school days? Were you making a lot of short films with yourself in it, and did that give you insight?
I never ever made a short film or anything with myself in it before.
Okay.
As You Are, actually. Never.
So were you acting in short films at the same time as you were making them in school?
Yeah, I was acting in a bunch of them. I was acting in like B horror movies, which is kind of how As You Are came up. But yeah, I really like it. I think it's fun, and I always learn more about directing.
So when you said 3 movies set in your hometown, that means literally like Albany?
Yeah, Albany.
Not
yeah.
like metaphorical hometown.
No, like
Okay.
a literal hometown. I also have this project that I really. Did you meet when you were at Sundance, the Youth FX people?
I don't know if I did.
It's like this youth group in Albany that Madison, my old teacher, Bowen Suchak, runs for young kids of color from downtown Albany. That started off as this like after school film program, and now it's turned into a full production company where these kids are on salary, making ads, making short films, and they're fucking amazing. They worked on As You Are, they're gonna work on Mother's Milk, but now I've started developing a TV show with them that takes place at the baseball field that Madison and I played Little League at, which is kind of like in the hood in downtown Albany. So we're developing this show with them that would sort of also be, hopefully could become a kind of economy for the community as well, getting people into sort of production jobs and stuff like that, and allowing these kids and adults from the community to really tell the story of that place and tell their stories in a way that is not only going there and like filming them and saying like tell us your stories and then premiere it somewhere else and forgetting about it, but actually making them the producers and directors and writers of the show and sort of overseeing and helping and trying to see if there is a viable, because we think there is a viable way of actually using filmmaking and community organizing in tandem to really help people in their communities tell their stories, and by telling their stories also lifting up their community. So there isn't this feeling of if you want to be a filmmaker, if you want to do whatever, you have to go to New York or you have to go to Hollywood or you have to go to wherever, but that right now is a moment in time where like the industry is finally seeing the value in different voices, and that maybe there's a way of kind of grabbing this moment and doing something different and trying to build a new model for filmmaking that's sustainable and elevates the right people, you know?
Yeah, you'll be like the John DeLorean of Albany.
Yeah.